At 0600 hours local time, the intelligence officer monitoring the Caracas station received the encrypted transmission that would define the next 72 hours. The message contained 3 words: Maduro moves tonight. Across the Caribbean, in a secure operations center buried beneath a limestone ridge on the island of Puerto Rico, the duty watch commander at United States Southern Command received the same alert simultaneously. The information had come through back channels. Human intelligence developed over 18 months of careful cultivation inside Venezuela's military hierarchy. A general who'd grown tired of watching his country starve while Maduro's inner circle gorged themselves on embezzled oil revenues. A captain commanding a frigate who understood that loyalty to a dying regime guaranteed nothing except poverty for his children. These men represented the fracture lines in Venezuela's military structure, the cracks that competent operators had spent months widening with promises of asylum cash transfers, and the simple truth that the Maduro government was finished. The question was only how it would end. Violently or inevitably, the intelligence suggested violence was scheduled for that evening. Maduro had finally made his move. After months of political calculation, after consolidating control over the military's most loyal units, after executing 3 generals who'd shown insufficient enthusiasm for his continued rule, Maduro had decided to eliminate the remaining uncertainty. The plan was textbook authoritarian playbook: arrest the opposition leaders under charges of conspiracy with foreign powers, seize control of the National Assembly, deploy the military to suppress any public response. Within 48 hours, establish absolute control. Within 72 hours, execute anyone who'd provided intelligence to American handlers. The problem for Maduro was that American handlers had already anticipated exactly this sequence. The United States had spent 2 years positioning assets, cultivating relationships, and preparing contingencies for precisely this moment. What Maduro didn't know was that the American response wasn't going to diplomatic protests or UN Security Council resolutions that Russia and China would immediately veto. The response was going to be something Venezuela hadn't experienced in 3 decades of decline. Immediate, overwhelming military action designed not to conquer, but to decapitate the regime's ability to control its own territory. At 100 hours, while Maduro was still finalizing arrest orders in the Presidential Palace, the first wave of assets began moving into position. It started with the submarines. 2 Virginia-class attack submarines, USS New Jersey and USS Hawaii, had been conducting routine operations in the Caribbean for weeks, their presence unremarkable against the background noise of normal naval deployments. At noon, both submarines received their operational orders through extremely low-frequency communication channels, message transmitted at glacial speeds to penetrate the depths, but carrying information that would reshape the hemisphere. The orders were simple: move to designated launch points, stand by for weapons release authorization. Within 4 hours, both submarines had repositioned to coordinates approximately 120 nautical miles from the Venezuelan coast, positioning that placed them outside detection range of Venezuela's aging naval radar, but well within strike range of every significant installation in the country. The submarines carried 38 Tomahawk cruise missiles between them, which had evolved significantly since their first combat employment during the 1991 Gulf War. Modern variants carried advanced terrain mapping guidance systems, satellite-corrected GPS positioned to it within 10 meters, sensor-fused submunition capable of defeating hardened targets, and a track record of devastating accuracy across 3 decades of continuous combat operations. Each missile cost approximately $1.4 million. The entire payload represented $53 million of precision ordnance. What made that expenditure strategically rational was that it could accomplish in 90 seconds what a conventional invasion would require months to achieve, at a cost measured in billions rather than millions, with 0 American combat casualties instead of hundreds or thousands. At 1430 hours, while Maduro was conducting his final operational briefing with the security ministers, the first wave of Air Force assets launched from bases in Florida. 4 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers, the most advanced aircraft in human history, took off from Homestead Air Force Base with a full weapons load. Each aircraft carried 8 AW-31 precision-guided bunker-busting munitions, warheads specifically designed to penetrate reinforced underground facilities before detonating. The bombers represented approximately $2 billion of technology in 4 aircraft. Their operational cost ran roughly $170,000 per flight hour. But what made that investment irreplaceable was that Venezuela possessed no air defense system capable of detecting them. The B-2's radar cross-section measured approximately the size of a marble. Venezuelan air defense consisted of aging Soviet-era S-300 systems installed during the Cold War, radars operating on frequencies that B-2 design had specifically engineered to defeat, installations operations that would provide no warning before American precision ordnance turned them into burning wreckage. The bombers climbed to cruise altitude and southward over the Atlantic, their stealth profile invisible to every radar system from Miami to Caracas. Their flight time to target would measure approximately 4 hours. The timing had been carefully calculated. The bombers would arrive over Venezuelan airspace at precisely 20:30 hours local time, the moment when Maduro was scheduled to address the military high command, announcing the new constitutional arrangement and the consolidation of total authority. The moment when every senior commander in the Venezuelan military would be gathered in the Fortuna military headquarters in downtown Caracas. At 1600 hours, the carrier strike group George Washington, the maneuver that would announce to the world that this was no longer a diplomatic crisis, but an active military operation. The carrier, displacing 97,000 tons with a full complement of 75 aircraft, had been conducting routine operations in the Caribbean for 6 weeks. Routine position had placed the ship approximately 300 miles northeast of the Venezuelan coast, positioned to be useful as erupted. At 1600 hours, the carrier launched 18 F-A-89 Super Hornet fighter jets. The launch sequence took 45 minutes. Aircraft accelerated down the flight deck, launching every 90 seconds, climbing to altitude and forming into combat formations. The aircraft represented only $1.4 billion of advanced fighter technology. Each pilot represented 10,000 hours of training spanning 15 years of military service. Each aircraft carried air-to-air missiles, air-to-ground munitions, and electronic warfare systems that represented the frontier of modern military capability. The fighters turned southwest toward the Venezuelan coast, their flight time to loiter position measuring approximately 40 minutes. What made their deployment significant wasn't that 18 fighters could defeat the entirety of Venezuela's Air Force. Venezuela's Air Force consisted of approximately 40 operational aircraft distributed across a network of aging bases. The F-818s could defeat them all simultaneously if combat occurred. What made the deployment significant was that it announced to every military officer in Venezuela that the Americans weren't bluffing. Fighter aircraft launching from a carrier strike group meant someone was going to die. Either this would end with a coup, or it would end with a military clash that Venezuela would lose with catastrophic consequences. That message reached Maduro at 1630 hours, when American intelligence liaison provided it to Venezuelan opposition figures who'd been placed under protective custody in Colombia. The message was simple. The Americans are moving. If you're going to act, the window is closing. The opposition leaders, men who'd spent 3 years in exile watching their families suffer under Maduro's regime, watching the currency collapse to worthless paper, watching the military crack down on any dissent, understood what American military deployment meant. It meant they had approximately 4 hours to either launch a counter-coup or prepare for a new regime that would be entirely dependent on American support and entirely subject to American conditions. They chose to launch the counter-coup. At 16:45 hours, the first radio broadcasts began emerging from Venezuelan military bases. Commanders loyal to the opposition faction, having received the intelligence about American military deployment, began making their own announcements. The generals who'd cultivated relationships with American handlers, who'd received guarantees of asylum and protection if things went wrong, began openly breaking with Maduro's government. The commander of the military's 1st Division announced that his forces would not participate in the announced crackdown. The admiral commanding the Caribbean squadron announced that the Venezuelan Navy would not defend the presidential palace. The commander of the Air Force announced that his pilots would defend against any external aggression, but would not participate in internal operations against the civilian government. Within 30 minutes, Maduro's military support structure had collapsed like a house of cards exposed to hurricane-force winds. Maduro attempted to respond by ordering the Presidential Guard, the elite units that had always remained loyal to him, to arrest the generals who'd broken ranks. The Presidential Guard commander received the order at 700 hours. He also received, simultaneously, a direct phone call from an American officer at Southern Command offering $100 million, American citizenship, and a guarantee of personal safety if he refused the order. The commander, a man who'd spent 30 years watching the American military capability from a distance, understood that resistance was not only futile but suicidal. His guard unit consisted of 2,000 men. The Americans had already deployed more firepower than was necessary to eliminate his unit completely. He refused the order. At 7:20 hours, Maduro realized that his government had ended, not through popular uprising, not through street riots, not through the slow pressure of economic collapse, though those things had all contributed. His government had ended because the American military had decided it would end, and because the military officers he'd relied upon to maintain control had rationally calculated that their survival was better served by abandoning him. Maduro to flee the president presidential palace. The Venezuelan National Guard, the internal security force theoretically loyal to the regime, had already sealed the palace. Orders from the newly assertive opposition military commanders had locked down every exit. The Presidential Guard commander, having decided to break ranks with Maduro, had his troops turn around and face inward, preventing the president from leaving. Maduro's government didn't end with a dramatic confrontation. It ended with him trapped in the presidential palace, screaming into phones that nobody was answering, watching his authority evaporate in real time as every military commander in the country announced loyalty to the opposition government. At 17:45 hours, the B-2 bombers were 90 minutes from Venezuelan airspace. The submarines were holding position, missiles loaded, waiting for final authorization. The F-818 fighters had reached their combat patrol altitude and were orbiting 100 nautical miles northeast of Caracas, weapons ready, awaiting engagement authority. None of it would be necessary now. The military coup had succeeded without a shot being fired. American military power had accomplished in 75 minutes what no amount of diplomatic pressure, sanctions, or international condemnation could have achieved in 75 years. At 1:800 hours, the opposition military commanders announced the formation of a provisional government and the immediate detention of Nicolas Maduro on charges of crimes against humanity, embezzlement of national resources, and ordering extrajudicial killings. The announcement was broadcast simultaneously on every Venezuelan radio and television network. The provisional government announced that new elections would be held within 6 months. The provisional government announced that it welcomed international observers and international support in rebuilding Venezuela's shattered economy. The provisional government that it was grateful for the decisive American military support that had made this transition possible, and that it intended to cooperate fully with the United States on regional security matters. At 18:15 hours, the B-2 bombers updated orders while still in flight. The orders were simple: mission abort to base. The bombers turned northward and began the 4-hour journey back to Florida. They would land without firing a single weapon. $53 million in precision ordnance would be returned to storage, ready for the next contingency. The submarines received the same orders and began repositioning away from Venezuelan territorial waters. The carrier strike group received orders to maintain position but stand down from combat alert. The F-818 fighters, still orbiting offshore, received orders to prepare for redeployment. What had just occurred was nothing short of revolutionary in terms of modern military operations. The United States had accomplished a complete regime change without firing a shot, without a single casualty, without American forces ever crossing into Venezuelan territory. The regime change had been accomplished entirely through the application of military capability and the credible threat of its employment. Every general in Venezuela had understood that American military technology was incomparably superior to anything Venezuela possessed. Every general had understood that if American military capability was actually employed, Venezuelan military forces would be obliterated. Every general had understood that survival meant switching sides before the shooting started. The brilliance of the operation wasn't in its violence. The brilliance was in its prevention of violence through overwhelming demonstration of capability. This was military strategy at the highest level, not warfare but the credible threat of warfare, backed by demonstrated capability and willingness to employ it. The demonstration that Venezuela's military could not protect Maduro, could not defend their country, could not do anything except accept American dictates or watch their entire command structure obliterated by precision ordnance. At 1900 hours, Secretary of State James Anderson appeared at the State Department podium in Washington and issued a statement regarding the situation in Venezuela. The statement expressed the United States government's support for the provisional government. The statement emphasized that the transition had resulted from internal Venezuelan military actions rather than external intervention. The statement noted that the United States would be prepared to provide humanitarian assistance and economic support to help Venezuela rebuild. The statement carefully avoided mentioning that American submarines had been positioned to launch cruise missiles, that American stealth bombers had been in the air carrying bunker-busting ordnance, that American fighter jets had been prepared for combat operations. The fiction had to be maintained that this was an internal Venezuelan matter that happened to coincide with American military movements in the region. The Russian Foreign Ministry immediately issued a statement condemning the situation as an example of American imperialism and hegemonic interference in the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. The Russian statement was carefully worded to allow Russia to save face while avoiding any actual response. Understood, as every great power understood, that Venezuela's military could not be defended against American military capability. Russia understood that Venezuela had been in the American sphere of influence geographically and strategically for 150 years. superpowers. Russia understood that objecting to American military dominance in its own hemisphere was pointless theater. The statement was for domestic consumption, a way to demonstrate to the Russian public their government was still relevant and still opposed to American hegemony. It meant nothing strategically. China issued a statement expressing hope that the situation would be resolved peacefully through dialogue and international cooperation. The Chinese statement avoided taking sides or condemning American actions. China understood that Venezuela was not a core strategic interest. China understood that maintaining the supply of Venezuelan oil, which would flow regardless of which government was in power, was the only concern that mattered. A provisional government that welcomed international investment and international trade was actually preferable to Maduro's regime, which had systematically destroyed Venezuela's ability to produce anything. A provisional government backed by American military power would be stable and functional. That is China's interest. Within 12 hours of the coup, the new Venezuelan government was recognized by every major nation except Russia, which abstained from recognition while continuing to protest American imperialism. Within 24 hours, international financial institutions were preparing packages of economic assistance and technical support. Within 48 hours, Venezuelan generals were making pilgrimage to the American embassy in Caracas to personally thank the officers who'd orchestrated the military transition. What nobody in the international community wanted to acknowledge was what this operation actually demonstrated. It demonstrated that the United States possessed the capability and the willingness to replace governments anywhere in the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot. It demonstrated that American military superiority was so overwhelming that nations with air forces, navies, and armies simply chose not to fight. It demonstrated that the calculus of modern military conflict had fundamentally shifted toward overwhelming technological superiority, creating a monopoly on decision-making capability. American military planners understood what they'd accomplished in Venezuela. They'd proven that precision military capability, combined with psychological warfare and informations, could achieve political objectives that decades of sanctions and diplomatic pressure could never touch. They'd proven that generals commanding conventional military forces understood the mathematics of modern warfare well enough to know that fighting the American military meant losing not just battles, but their entire command structure, their lives, their families' futures. The implications rippled outward across the entire hemisphere. In Colombia, military officers watched the Venezuelan operation, understood that any thoughts of destabilization would be met with immediate American military response. In Mexico, military and political leaders watched and understood that cooperation with American objectives was not optional. In Central America, regional powers watched and understood that their security was dependent on American goodwill. In the broader Caribbean, every island nation understood that Venezuela's fate was a warning about what happened to nations that American military command deemed destabilized or threatening to American interests. 3 weeks after the coup, classified American military assessments concluded that the operation had cost approximately $3 billion in fuel, transportation, maintenance, and operational expenses. More precisely, it had cost the value of the precision ordnance that had been positioned but never fired, the fuel burned by aircraft that never dropped weapons, the submarine operations that had moved into position but never launched missiles. $3 billion in military capability deployed to prevent a situation from occurring rather than to remedy it after the fact. That calculation would never appear in any public document. That calculation would be classified at the highest levels and discussed only in closed-door Pentagon briefings. But the calculation was sound. The alternative to surgical military positioning was the conventional invasion option. Invasion of Venezuela would have required between 20 and 30,000 troops. Invasion would have required establishing air superiority over the entire country. Invasion would have required occupation operations for months or years. Invasion would have cost dozens or hundreds of American lives. Invasion would have generated international condemnation and potential military response from China and Russia, though that response would have been limited to weapons transfers to anti-American groups. The American military leadership understood that when the objective is changing a government, doing it without firing a shot is infinitely superior to doing it with conventional military force. What the Venezuelan operation demonstrated to every military strategist on the planet was that the age of conventional military power had effectively ended. When one nation possesses such overwhelming military superiority that nations simply choose not to fight, when the mere demonstration of capability is sufficient to achieve political objectives, conventional armies become theater props. Venezuela's air force, navy, and army were completely irrelevant to the outcome. Mattered was that the American military possessed the capability to destroy those forces completely, and that capability was credible enough that Venezuelan generals rationally chose not to test it. The operation would be studied in military academies across the world. It would be taught as an example of modern military operations at the highest levels of strategic planning. It would be analyzed in think tanks and policy institutes across the developed world. The fundamental lesson was unavoidable. In a world where one nation possesses overwhelming technological military superiority, that nation's strategic will become the determining factor in regional outcomes. Venezuela's fate had been decided not by Venezuelan politicians or Venezuelan generals. Venezuela's fate had been decided by American military planners in Florida, by American submarine commanders in the Atlantic, by American pilots launching from aircraft carriers, by American strategic planners who understood that modern military power was not about warfare, but about the credible threat of overwhelming force, applied so precisely that it accomplished political objectives without requiring the application of that force. Within a month of the coup, Venezuela's new government had signed bilateral security agreements with the United States. Within 2 months, American military advisors were stationed at Venezuelan military bases. Within 3 months, Venezuela's military was being reorganized and re-equipped with American military technology. Within 6 months, the new provisional government had scheduled elections and begun the process of rebuilding Venezuelan institutions along lines compatible with American strategic interests. The regime change in Venezuela wasn't a victory in any traditional military sense. No battles had been fought, no territory had been conquered, no enemy combatants had been defeated in combat, but it was a demonstration of power so complete that every military strategist on the planet understood what it meant. American military dominance was so overwhelming that nations could be changed by the mere credible threat of American military capability. The age of military symmetry had ended. The age of American military monopoly on decision-making capability in the Western Hemisphere had been re-established, and every nation on Earth had watched and understood exactly what that meant for their own strategic futures.